Okay, John, over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for attending. Yeah, the seminar series this year is going to be based on the book on psychoanalysis and the mind-body problem. And when I conceived of this project, I really wanted to have a inclusive a focus to the book where it looked at various types of schools of thought in the psychoanalytic community. So the chapters are from multiple perspectives, everything from classical Freudian theory to Jung to Lacan to modern conceptions of neuroscience today to mentalization theory to advances in semiotics to evolutionary anthropology to technology and also on clinical practice. And so it is with great pleasure for me to introduce Dr. Barnaby Barratt, who, as many of you probably know, is a pillar of our field. And he contributed one of the chapters, one of the opening chapters to the project. And so we're delighted that he's going to talk about that today. But Dr. Barratt is currently Director of Studies at the Parkmore Institute and Senior Research Fellow with the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. For a significant portion of his mid-career, he was Professor of Family Medicine, Psychiatry, and Behavioral Neurosciences at Wayne State University, which is in Detroit. Formerly a training analyst for a decade with the Michigan Psychoanalytic Institute, Dr. Barratt is currently a training analyst with the South African Psychoanalytic Association and supervising analyst with the Indian Psychoanalytic Society. He is a member of the International Psychoanalytic Association, as well as a fellow of the American Psychological Association and the American Academy for Psychoanalysis and Psychology. Dr. Barratt's the author of 5 books on psychoanalysis, all published by Routledge, and most recently completed a trilogy titled Rediscovering Psychoanalysis. And this actually was the winner of the American Board and Academy of Psychoanalysis Book Prize, which is very coveted. Additionally, he's published numerous other books and articles in everything from philosophy, sexuality, semantic psychology, and spirituality. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Dr. Barratt.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson, and thank you, Dr. Mills. Can I be heard well? Okay, good. I'm actually very honored to be invited for this and very honored to be part of something at the prestigious University of Essex program. I do have to say that as those of you who know South Africa, we have a wobbly infrastructure, and currently we have rolling blackouts. So there's a small possibility that somewhere between now and 7:30, I'll be plunged into darkness, in which case there'll be an exciting 2-minute hiatus to my talk. And then I'll find a way to get a substitute electrical system. I'm sorry, was someone? No. It was an honor to be part of Dr. Mills's book on the mind-body problem. And it's a little pointless for me to rehearse the chapter. You can easily go read it. So I thought what I'd do, which I think would be most stimulating for the purposes of discussion, is to talk a little bit about the sort of the overarching argument and how I came to make it. I came to psychoanalysis as an undergraduate I had to drop out. I had a significant depression as an undergraduate, and I dropped out of my studies. And I was extremely fortunate to get psychoanalytic psychotherapy. And it absolutely enthralled me to learn that my mind didn't work the way that I thought it did, and that people that I held dear to me weren't entirely as unambivalently positioned in my mind as I had thought they were, and so on and so forth, the sort of undergraduate epiphany that so many of us had. And when I returned to studies in social psychology, I discovered that Freud was not really well regarded within the field of psychology, this being in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And that actually fascinated me. And it, in a way, fascinates me today, the divergence of opinions about a topic like, about a field like psychoanalysis, and the hostility it has engendered historically, and the passion and devotion it has also engendered, and the enormous value it's had to humanity in its sort of demystifying capability and its healing properties. Now, if you were an alien from outer space approaching this planet, and you were asked to report back to some far-flung galaxy about what psychoanalysis is, you actually, I think, would be very hard to give it a definition, because it has become such a plurality today, with such diverse, fundamentally diverse assumptions about the nature of the human condition, fairly divergent practices as to what healing should involve, that in a way we don't have a field that can be labeled and can be seen as a unity. And that too is a rather fascinating feature. We have within our field positions and assumptions about, for instance, infancy and the capabilities of infants that are very divergent. We have theories of human motivation that are quite divergent. And then we have the thing that supposedly loosely holds us together as a community, which is a notion of the unconscious. But the closer one looks at the notion of the unconscious, the more one realizes that there are actually many notions and concepts, or at least several notions and concepts under one label. So I have made a major thread of my career to return to Freud and to look at how this sort of comes about, what Freud generated. This is not to disrespect the contributions of Jung or of any other lineage that is outside of the mainstream psychoanalytic movement. And then, of course, the problem is what Freud or which Freud does one return to? What Freud or which Freud does one look at? Because as much as devoted Freudians, some of them, would like to see his writings as monolithic, they're not. They're quite full of contradictions, and they track back and forth in different ways. And as much as some passionate readers of Freud would like to say that there is a sort of a steady progression in his thinking, there isn't. In fact, in my view, which is preceded by Andre Green, there is a sort of a break around 1915. So how I'd like to start is a very schematic reading of Freud from what might be considered a sort of existential point of view, by which I mean a point of view that prioritizes lived experience and the sort of method by which we approach lived experience and its exploration. As a preface, I think we can hold in mind that at the end of his life, Freud really said that there were two discoveries he felt he had made of lasting value. One was the unconscious, but I think very specifically he meant the unconscious as repressed. And the other is sexuality, which again, I think we can understand to mean not sex as it's commonly understood in this culture, but sexuality in terms of the sensuality of the body, the fundamentality of our embodied experience in generating whatever we call our mind. So here's a very schematic and entirely illegitimate reading of Freud, because there really is no legitimate reading of Freud. One, in a way, pirates his writings as one wishes. And in a certain sense, I've pirated them in the following manner. Up to about 1895, he spent 17 years delving into physiology. And he was doing exciting things like dissecting the gonads of eels and so forth. And in that time, much to the envy of every academic, he managed to publish about 200 articles in 17 years. So there's a phenomenal intellectual scientific output there. Prior to what I think we can date as the discovery of psychoanalysis. As we all know, the discovery of psychoanalysis emerged in a way from his workings with hysteria and conversion symptoms. But in many respects, the significance of conversion and symptoms is the way in which the body speaks and what it means to say that the body speaks. And you may remember, I think it is Fraulein Elizabeth, whose pains in her legs, as Freud put it, quote unquote, joined in our conversation. A fascinating and different way to think of the significance and the signifying properties of our sensual embodiment. So he embarks, I think, on from 1895 until about 1915 in an exploration of the human condition, which is very focused on the method of free association. Now, I have written probably far too much, in most people's opinion, exploring what free association is and what it isn't. But the thing that and actually in a couple of months, there's, I think, the best piece that I've ever written on it is coming out in Psychoanalytic Review, because I think there's something poetic and erotic about free association, which has not been fully appreciated. Too frequently, free association can mean many things, and I'm not claiming that any of them are illegitimate, but the one that I think is most important is not the idea of free association as a somewhat logical or logical in some subterranean logical and rhetorical fashion sequence of stories. I think the most interesting feature of free association is the way it disrupts. Its sort of existential power to unsettle. And what does it unsettle? I think one can argue in line with a sort of a phenomenological position, but a phenomenology that is very different from Husserlian egology, which followed Freud some 2 decades later. I think you can argue that it unsettles the human subject, if by the human subject you mean what, in a very loose riff on Kant, you mean the I think that connects or that makes a system out of all the thoughts, feelings, motivations that we have. Because the thoughts, feelings, and motivations we have, what is commonly called our psychology, have the fundamental feature that they're all in some sense representations. They may be imagistic representations, they may be narratological, they may be inactive representations, but psychology is representational. And our psychology is held in a way by this sort of I that accompanies everything I experience. It's as if, to do the riff on Kant, it's as if there is an I think that conjoins every representation that we can experience. And in a way, what free association does, unlike any other method, is it unsettles our sense of coherence and continuity and cogency of our subjective experience. It's this unsettling quality that I think is vitally important. So from about 1895 to 1915, you can see Freud's writings as really being a grand experiment in the method of free association. Now, this is very schematic. Obviously, you can argue with the way I'm presenting this, and you'd be quite right to argue with it. But around 1915, there is really a turn in which Freud becomes more systematic. Now, he had become systematic in the time of the interpretation of dreams. He presents his topography, and he presents ideas about energy, and energy in the transformation of representations, and energy in the disruption, in the continuity and cogency of the transformation of representations. 1915, he writes those 3 papers that are so fabulous and yet fabulously difficult to read. The 3 I have in mind, I'm leaving out instinct, is instincts, repression, and the unconscious. And after 1915, there is a sort of a shift in the way he presents psychoanalysis and what he thinks about and how he wants to move psychoanalysis forward. This is the break, the caesura, as Andre Green called it. Because after 1915, in some way, he becomes much more preoccupied with systematic theorizing. So 1914, you get the theory of narcissism, you get Mourning and Melancholia 4 years later. In 1920, you get Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And then 1923 and 1927, you get the grand formulations of the structural functional theory. And it's so interesting and in some way such an aberration that when you go to undergraduate textbooks, what psychoanalysis is presented as typically is its grand theory, its hermeneutic formulation of the ego, the id, and the superego, or of latterly a progression from disorganized functioning, what is later called the paranoid schizoid position, to the depressive position. If you step back, however, it seems to me that these are grand theories of a quasi-objectivistic nature. They are theories about the mind. They're theories how you can take the data of human functioning and formulate it. It's very different from what was, in a way, so prioritized in 1895 to 1915, which is lived experience and the unsettling of lived experience. So out of that, Freud really has 2 ideas that are of great importance, and they're represented in a rather peculiar fashion in the interpretation of dreams in 1900 and in the 3 theories of sexuality in 1905. That the lived experience he has, the praxis of free association, using the word praxis now to mean something quite different from practice. Praxis to mean something about the way in which ideas and method and a sort of proto-theorizing come into play. Out of his experience with free association comes 2 what he calls Hilfsvorstellungen, helpful ideas, not formulated scientific concepts, but helpful ideas, meaning ideas that actually promote and support an ongoing engagement with free associative practice. And one of them is the idea of psychic energy, which I think is pivotal to the valuable discussion we're engaging in as to what psychoanalysis contributes to the mind-body problem. Because psychic energy is, in a way, neither of the mind entirely, it's neither identical with neuronal functioning, nor is it of our psychology, it's not identical with our representational transformations. And Freud makes this very clear, but he sort of drops it. And he drops it because it's really not tenable within the Western canon. In 1913, for example, he says we are compelled to postulate the notion, the Hilfsvorstellung of drive, which is later, as in Ilke Quindau's book and Laplanche's work, I think a better word would be desire. We are forced to postulate this notion of psychic energy as between biology and psychology. And we'll come back to that in a minute as to what on earth it can mean to say that something is between our biology and our psychology, because it's a very provocative statement. It's a statement that runs entirely against the Cartesian tradition that dominated Western thinking, and Freud knew that well. And in some certain extent, he then sidelines his notion of psychic energy, particularly in a way after 1915. Again, all these statements I'm making can be contested and can be qualified, but I think this is an interesting way of thinking, because I think it actually goes, for me, it goes to the heart of the uniqueness of psychoanalytic discourse. And remember, psychoanalytic discourse is not identical with what happens in psychoanalytic psychotherapy. In fact, curiously enough, right at the end of his life, Freud said to Karl Abraham that he'd never really been interested in psychotherapy. He was interested in the human condition and what he could learn about it. So the first Hilfsvorstellung is this notion of psychic energy and what Freud does with it. The second thing that I think is interesting is the notion of repression. And here he attempts to summarize, I think, 20 years in the 1915 papers. He attempts in a way to summarize 20 years of working with free association. And the 1915 papers are highly contentious and open to certain sorts of reading. And I'm going to suggest a quite aberrant reading, but I think it's one that is actually vital. One way of reading those papers on the repression and on the unconscious is to look at what he says about thing presentations and to ask oneself, are thing presentations, is he really pushing towards simply talking about representations that don't have symbolic form or don't fit into what I've called the narratological imperative? Is he simply talking about disruptive forms of representation, or is he trying to articulate something else? And I would suggest that one way of jumping off from what he says is as follows: that the mind, the psychodynamics of the mind, are such that when in conflict, the mind, the I, the subjectivity, consciousness, there are two sorts of things that can happen to representations. One thing, as we well know, that can happen to representations is they get suppressed. And here it's difficult to read Freud because he slides around using the term repression when he actually means things that are descriptively unconscious, which is actually not a good way at confusing to present it in that manner. But we know that things can get repressed, right? What my lover said to me last week that hurt my feelings so deeply, I don't remember. It's forgotten. I've defended against it. Suppression encompasses a multitude of defensive organizations by which I simply don't know what actually, in some sense, I do know. So things that are repressed retain their representational form, which means that when I go to some clever psychotherapist who says to me, you know, you had difficulty with what your lover said last week because it hurt your feelings and this is what you did with it. And then you did this reaction formation and then you projected it in that way and then you denied it and all those sorts of things, all the incredible potpourri of things that we think of as defense mechanisms. We can put that under the aegis of suppression because in a way those things retain their representational form, which means that when my therapist says it to me, like any forgotten memory, I can either recognize it, I might be able to reappropriate it, or if I don't recognize it, I can nonetheless make sense of it and deny it. So all those things are suppressed, still remain somehow in the mind, though I know that the expression in the mind is actually quite dodgy, but they remain in the mind as representational. If you read the notion of thing formations in one way, it would appear that what Freud might be pushing towards is that when things are repressed, as distinct from suppression, when things are repressed, they actually lose their representational form. They cross what Freud called the repression barrier. And if you read Freud carefully, it's very clear that the repression barrier, which he wrote about, is the incest taboo. It is the counter with incest that is the distinctive feature of Oedipality, which I don't like to be self-promotional, but I do think that my 2019 paper on Oedipality, which came out in the International Journal, is one of my better ones. And I would like to think an important one. However, so when things are repressed, they lose their representational form. They, so to speak, if one uses a spatial sort of analogy and spatial thinking about psychic matters is actually very dangerous and tendentious. They lose their representational form, but Freud says very clearly, they do not lose their activity. They persist. And not only do they persist, but they insist. They try to get back into representational form. And how do they insist upon the representational system? Freud is very clear. They cannot be translated back into representation. So what is the repressed? I would suggest to you that the repressed continues as traces of energy, traces of psychic energy within our embodiment. And you can see here already that I'm pushing towards a sort of reading of somatic psychoanalysis that is very congruent with things coming from the world of body psychotherapy that have burgeoned in the last 20 years. Bessel van der Kolk, Stanley Kellerman, all those sorts of people. The idea that the body, our embodiment, is an alive container of lived experiences in non-representational form, in energetic form, and in energetic form that remains locked within our embodiment and that pushes back as if it's pushing towards trying to get back into representation. But how did Freud define repression in the mid-1920s, even after really he'd shifted away into grand theorizing and away from the existential praxis of free association? He said the repressed is what cannot be translated. Yeah, everyone remembers that from his correspondence with Ernst Jones. So the repressed is the untranslatable, the active but untranslatable. It's energy, it's traces of energy embodied. And you can also perhaps see how congruent this way of thinking about psychoanalysis is with, for instance, Derridian deconstruction, or the work of Deleuze and Guattari, and a number of others. So we have these two notions, these two helpful notions. Again, to repeat myself, a helpful notion is not a scientifically formulated concept. It's a notion that helps praxis. It's a notion that helps the praxis of lived experience. His notion of psychic energy and of the unconscious as repressed, meaning the deformation of representations into things that become unthinkable but remain traces of energy within us. And put like that, I hope you can see how his notion of the repression barrier is really the intrapsychic inscription of the incest taboo. He never says that, but if you look at the way his talk about the incest taboo and his talk about repression arise in his writings, particularly the writings between 1895 and 1905, it's like the ideas are there in parallel, but he doesn't quite conjoin the two at any point in time. So here we come to a rather different reading of the whole issue of the body-mind. I don't like talking about the mind-body, with all due respect to Dr. Mills's title, because I think in a way it takes us, okay, let's put it in the manner that I open my chapter within that anthology. The whole question is what's in the hyphen? Or if one prefers to write it as body/mind, what's in the slash? What exactly is going on when we separate body and mind in our thinking in a Cartesian manner? Now, what Freud has done, and Freud was undoubtedly aware of this, and while one shouldn't go too far with ad hominem speculation, I think his push or his move away from a sort of very existentially oriented praxis of free association, the move away to grand theorizing from 1914, 1915 onwards, is in a way because on some level, I think he had some awareness that he had done something rather drastic with the whole Western canon. For a start, in positing psychic energy, he's positing a notion that directly and flagrantly, in a way, goes against the whole Western tradition of science that things have to be demonstrable, and if not measurable, they have to be in some sense consensually agreed upon. And psychic energy sort of eludes that. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So perhaps this notion that he had effectively, and sort of knew it, made a grand break with what Foucauldians call the analytico-referential master discourse of the modern era of the West, perhaps drove him back to a more scientific traditional stance. Because what comes after 1915 is really, with perhaps the exception of the 1920 monograph, is really in a way grand theoretical formulations, theories of mental functioning from which one can create a sort of hermeneutic technique useful for healing. Going back to psychic energy then, how are we to understand what Freud has done? And one way to think about it is to appeal to Spinoza, a philosopher who has had who in many ways was much forgotten in his time and shortly thereafter. But there have been in European philosophy sort of vogues for like trying to reread Spinoza, and particularly his ethics. Spinoza said that the mind and the body are two attributes of the same substance. And if you read my paper in Dr. Mills's anthology, there are several things that can be said about this. But what Freud has done essentially is to posit a third attribute. Spinoza said there are two expressions of one attribute, and there are two attributes of one thing, which he called substance. And there is here a tradition within the Western canon of trying to talk about something outside the mind-body dichotomy. You can think here of some of the pre-Socratics, like Heraclitus or Anaximander. You can think not only of Spinoza, but you can think of the tradition that comes down to Nietzsche, who attempted to critique the mind-body dichotomy of Cartesianism by talking about force fields, all the way down to people like Deleuze and Guattari, who talk about the plane of eminence. There's these sort of subversive elements in the Western tradition of people trying to talk about a different sort of ontology, a different sort of way of looking at being. And I think that actually you can read Freud right in this tradition. It doesn't mean he can't be read within a much more conventional, objectivistic, scientific sort of tradition, but he becomes much less interesting if you insist on reading him that way. Psychic energy, then, is part of what one might think of as a sort of a trifold ontology. I don't like that term. I used it somewhere in one of my books, and I don't like it, but it's the best I could do at the time. That there is the mind, by which we mean the whole system of representations that we're familiar with, and that to some degree or other are always reappropriable on reflection. And there's the body, which is the familiar sort of semi-familiar system of neuronal functioning that we know about from neuroscience. And then there's this thing called psychic energy. Now, as an aside, and I deal with this in my chapter, I think that many neuroscientists, Damasio being one conspicuous example, have sort of appropriated Spinoza in an illegitimate way. Because the thing that is striking about psychic reality, and that is actually not congruent with Spinoza's thinking, is yes, there is something other than mind and body, and yes, psychic energy, and psychic energy actually in some way is integral to the functioning of the body and integral to the functioning of the mind. Thus far, we're with Spinoza's substance, but psychic energy is notably disrupted. Freud is very clear that it is not identical. He's not identical with biological functioning. not identical with biological functioning. That's why, and this, I think, is the invaluable contribution of Laplanche and Laplanche's reading of Freud's notion of Anlehnung. It's not identical with the body, and it's not identical with representation, because psychic energy disrupts, as I said earlier, the coherence and the cogency and the continuity of our subjectivity of representationality. So we come around to thinking about a rather different way of thinking. And for me, and I have been trained in the tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, and I have lived quite extensively in India and have some acquaintance with the traditions of Sanatana Dharma, Hinduism, Jainism, Buddhism, and so forth. For me, what is fascinating is, could we not see this as Freud's discovery of something that, a westernized discovery of something that has always been there in Eastern traditions? Psychic energy is rather like chi. It's rather like prana. It's rather like mana in the oceanic tradition. And you then come across the fascinating feature that every indigenous culture that we know anything about has a notion of psychic energy. And it's a notion of psychic energy that permeates everything, body and mind. Only in the post-Cartesian Western tradition have we insisted that things must either be material or they can be immaterial. That either or of materiality or immateriality, of body or of mind, that sort of thinking is actually quite restricted to what is the hegemonic dominant tradition in our global culture, namely Western modernism. No other culture thinks like that. So is it possible that what Freud discovered is that actually there is, so to speak, a third force that conjoins body and mind and conjoins, that permeates both of them, and yet in some ways is not concordant with either of them. And that would be germane to the discovery of something that's vitally important, namely, if we are all of the time, not just suppressing things we don't want to know, not just suppressing how my lover hurt my feelings last week, or how my mother said this to me on my 5th birthday, or how my father hit me when I was 15, or blah, blah, blah. Not just suppressing those very important representations, but also repressing things that become unthinkable, but remain within us bodily, somatically, sensually. And therefore, it makes a lot more sense to bring psychoanalysis together with those body psychotherapists that are trying to talk about how, in Bessel van der Kolk's words, the body keeps the score. So this would be, I think, one way of thinking about the uniqueness of psychoanalysis, why it is enigmatic and extraordinary within the Western canon. It's also a way of being wary of the sort of imperialism of neuroscience, because the imperialism of neuroscience co-opts Spinoza's ideas, but does so in a way that I think is quite illegitimate, and that doesn't give room for the sort of thing that I think Freud may have discovered. And we can get very beguiled by theories of informational processing, such as Friston's free energy theory, which is actually nothing about energy at all. It's a mathematical model of information processing from the upper brain to the lower brain. We can get a little too beguiled by that, and a little bit too beguiled by neuroscience, when in fact something that is existentially very relevant to our functioning, Freud sort of rediscovers through free association, and which in indigenous traditions has been there all along. I think that's enough.
Well, thank you so much for that tour of Freud. I don't know if anybody has an observation or question to get us going here. If not, I'll pitch in my I don't know, rather lame probably idea here that perhaps this change you're talking about in Freud was a kind of metaphysics is could be seen as a manic defense against World War I and against his separation from Jung. And because Jung, psychic energy is absolutely fundamental to Jung's whole view. And I don't know if the break with Jung and the trauma of the war, which gave rise to the death instinct and all that, whether there was something about that that sent Freud into a kind of manic kind of attempt to find a safe place to position himself. I don't know how that sounds to you.
I would really like to listen to a discussion rather than have this as a back and forth with me, but so be it. No, that's a very astute point, and it's absolutely correct. There was his great dismay at World War I. There was increasing depression. There was a fall off in his own practice. There was the beginnings of his severe ill health, although the cancer was not diagnosed until somewhat later. Jung wrote about psychic energy a lot in like 1914, but in a very different way from Freud. And subsequently, Jung's trajectory actually was in some ways away from, in a paradoxical way, away from the body, though this too is a contentious way of characterizing it. I think there's no question of that. And I think that there's no question that the, what one can call the apostasies, Adler, Jung, later Steckel, even later Rank, but all that sort of dissension, in a way, what Freud is culpable of is being too committed to building a movement from the very start, which I addressed that whole issue of the secret committee that was supposed to, quote unquote, keep the faith, that was formed in 1911. He was far too keen to be a leader. He was far too keen to be Hannibal or Moses. And I think by 1914, 15, he became much more systematic. I don't know about characterizing it as a manic defense, but that's a very interesting idea. He became much more systematic and much more concerned to be accepted within the wider medical and scientific community, which I don't think had been such a preoccupation in the 20 years that psychoanalysis began, which more or less, as I pointed out, was a 20-year period in which he was exploring and experimenting with free association without there being these theoretical superstructures that are inobjectivistic. And what happens there, which I say in the chapter, and I've said several times in the trilogy that Dr. Mills was so kind as to mention, what happens there is actually a shift. We think of psychoanalysis as an epistemological project, first and foremost. In other words, it's something about what we can know and what we don't want to know, and how we can retrieve or expand what we know about ourselves. But there's a certain sense in which it perhaps should not be considered like that at all. The prioritization of epistemology as sort of first philosophy is a very Western notion. And the argument here, which is concordant with the sort of reading and of several things that are going on contemporarily in European philosophy, is to think of it as an ontoethical venture. That psychoanalysis is an ontoethical exploration. It's about allowing being to reveal itself and allowing being to reveal itself in an ethical manner. And we could go into much more detail of that. But what that is like saying is that for the best part of the last 100 years, it has been a mistake to think of psychoanalysis, not psychotherapy based on the models of superegoid and so and ego, and not psychoanalysis based on the model of the paranoid, schizoid, and depressive functioning, but to think of psychoanalysis as not primarily epistemological, but indeed as an entirely different sort of venture. And that comes up with other people. It comes up with Winnicott a little bit. It comes up with Bion, that idea that this is primarily an ontological venture. It comes up with Ogden most recently. But I think the point you're making about the shift 1914 and through the First World War and Freud's depression and isolation in the First World War, I think is very important in terms of understanding it in relation to his personal trajectory. Sorry, that was long-winded.
No, that's good. So Barbara, you've got your hand up, and then we've got several people in the chat. If you put something in chat, I'd encourage you to use the raise hand and make your point in person. But Barbara, you're, I think, first up here.
Thank you so much. I've really gotten a lot out of this so far. I was wondering if maybe, basically, I guess it's Jung's concept of the autonomous complex might cover some of the things that you're speaking about, also in terms of energy and non-representation, and how the body is, in fact, very moved by the autonomous complex. Would that make any sense to you?
It probably makes sense, but that's couching it in a very Jungian language. Am I correct?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. I'm not sure quite how that modifies what I've said. I'm very open to the idea. But Jung, like Freud, had such a strange trajectory of thinking, especially in relation to the body and sexuality. Can you say more? Because that would educate me.
Oh, well, no, I wouldn't like to educate you, but I'll just see if I could try. Because you also went into, let's say, indigenous thinking and feeling and functioning. And the autonomous complex would fit there also. So if we're talking about the autonomous complex, I guess Jung would be saying that a complex is formed out of a basic nucleus that might be called the archetype. And the fact that there is no representation for the autonomous complex, and yet there is tremendous activity and a drive or push to manifest itself or to get center stage. And in fact, the autonomous complex doesn't have any idea itself what it's doing. It's just out there taking center stage.
I think that's absolutely fascinating, and I would love to talk with you more about that. I attempted to write a paper on this about Jung, but I am really not as well schooled in Jung as I should be. But it is very interesting, going back to Dr. Henderson's introduction of these men's personal trajectories. And it's very interesting how Jung was interested in indigenous cultures, and Freud, by and large, was not. It's very interesting to me how Jung, in a way, and I stand to be corrected, but in a way moved away from sexuality between the 1914 papers and his work on archetypes. There's sort of a shift away from the body, at least as I read Jung, and to the limited extent I understand Jung. It's also interesting how at the end of his life, I was talking to this actually with a colleague in India just the other day. It's fascinating how Freud always had this sort of fascination, but he couldn't actually allow himself to be fascinated with Eastern philosophy. You know, starting with, he had a 17-year correspondence with Jurinder Shekhar Bose, the person who started the Indian Psychoanalytic Society in Calcutta. He had a 17-year correspondence that went back and forth and back and forth. And it started with Bose's thesis on repression, which is very interesting that it started at that point, which was 1922. And the interesting thing is, by and large, if you were one of Freud's correspondents, you had to initiate, and then you'd get a letter back. With Bose, fascinatingly, Freud kept reaching out to Bose. It was as if he was fascinated by Bose's preoccupation with maternality, with the maternal deity in South Asian cosmology, and similarly his interest in Buddhism. He sort of flirted with Buddhism, and as you may know, there's a story how almost at the end of his life, he was visited by a Japanese psychologist whose name I'm going to forget, but it begins with Y. And he allegedly left his consulting room and went into Anna Freud's consulting room and said, "This is what we've been talking about all along." So towards the end of his life, he allowed himself more interest and a less dismissive attitude to non-Western thinking. And Jung, of course, always had this fascination. Jung visited Africa, as we in Africa are very cognizant of that. But thank you. I'd love to talk more about this because I think you're onto something, and there may be convergences here that have been insufficiently explored.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
John?
Yeah, thank you, Barnaby. That was a wonderful lecture. Very stimulating. I guess I'd like to ask more about your conceptualization of psychic energy. On one hand, usually when we talk about mind-body, psyche soma, that usually, as you mentioned, there's either a crass material reductionism that is just part and parcel of any substance view of our embodiment. And so hence one of the major criticisms of contemporary philosophy of mind is its tendency toward biological reduction. However, there are new movements. David Chalmers in particular is now approaching the notion of panpsychism and even cosmopsychism. And so the traditional view, let's say from Spinoza, would be more of a dual aspect monism. You don't have the dualism. You don't have, like, all there is body as a material substance, and then you have mind as an immaterial, which makes no sense. But when we talk about psychic energies, often it's at least visualized as not being reducible to the physical. However, the physical couldn't really function without some kind of material, energetic stratification of substance in some way. So the dilemma is, what is the concept, or what is the ontological process or event that either stands for as a placeholder or an arc or a third moment of interconnecting the two spheres. And so I think whatever language we use and the authors of the book have used, I've kind of preferred to refer to it as unconscious experience. And I'm wondering if your notion, first of all, how do you resolve this dualism? Would you view from your system as either a dual aspect monism, and how does psychic energy play within that? And then the second is, how do you or how could you have a dialogue with the notion of experience as being energetic?
Are we going to be here the next 3 weeks, John? You've presented so many pertinent ideas. I'm not as familiar with David Chalmers as I should be, but I will certainly go and look at his books, which are sitting on my bookshelves. I'm not quite sure how to address. If you think about, if you explore this in relation to a notion, to Eastern notions, which are of great interest to me, if you explore it in the notion of psychic energy and you look at, well, how would it relate to something like chi or prana? Chi and prana are everywhere in the universe. They interconnect the universe. And they in some sense, animate biological material operations, and they animate mental immaterial operations. And yet, what I think is distinctive about psychic energy is its disruptive quality, which I think is distinctive to the way psychoanalysis presents it, and in a way challenges any idea that I'm just talking about prana or chi in a different context. I can't address all that you've very adeptly presented. I just think that we're thinking too much along. We're still too bound by Cartesianism. When we sit with patients and we look at and we live the experience of being with patients, we're very we can't help but be bound by the tradition in which our thinking has been engendered. And I think that I'm on sticky ground here, but I think that the reading of Spinoza that is very prominent in neuroscience is actually rather illegitimate, because what ends up happening so often in neuroscience is lived experience is subordinated to what we can know objectivistically about neuronal functioning. And that, I think, is a severe problem in our field. And I had something else to add to what you said. I know I'm not addressing all the points you made at all.
But that's fine. I share your views about, I'm not overly impressed with neuroscience as the panacea for understanding, mind, but not to negate the empirical fact that we're embodied.
Yes. There's 2 points actually that I just, in relation to what you've just said. Those of us who know you have a book coming out on experience are eager to read it, because I think what you say about, well, what is unconscious experience, I think is a provocative way of posing an important question, which I'm not going to attempt to answer. But there is something about the notion of experience that's very important here, an experience that cannot be reflectively encapsulated representationally. That's extremely important. And then you get to, well, what is psychoanalysis, and what as we as psychoanalytic practitioners got to learn from, for instance, what Eugen Gendlin is, or Gendlin, I've never known what Gendlin was saying when he talked about the felt sense. What does this mean about our notion of consciousness as the capacity we have to be aware of things that we can't reflect on? I mean, that you have to start thinking about consciousness as much more than that which we can reflect upon. We have to introduce more into our practice what Gerard Edelman called the distinction between primary and secondary consciousness. The idea of an awareness that you can't formulate gets to be very important here. That's one thing. And then we get also the other thing that you triggered was Freud was very clear in a Helmholtzian sort of way that he thought that psychic energy was endogenously generated. And this gets to be a whole issue around Laplanche and Laplanche's notion of enigmatic messages, and the notion that psychic experience leans on biological experience, if you can talk biological operations, but is non-identical with it, and energy comes in there, or in Laplanche's terms, enigmatic messages come in there. Of course, if you're exploring how this relates to a notion like prana or chi, there's no sense that prana and chi is endogenous. Prana and chi interconnects us transpersonally, which Dr. Miller, I think, goes to interestingly to your point about Jung, that you end up thinking that actually, what is the role of transpersonal thinking in psychoanalysis? And transpersonal thinking comes in the Jungian tradition and in a very different way in the Lacanian tradition. But if you pursue psychic energy like this, you start to think about how there's an interconnectedness. This is my sort of Buddhist riff on it. There's an interconnectedness of the universe and of us in the universe that is actually energetic. And that gives you a different way of thinking. It breaks away from the sort of the monadism, the idea of the autonomous individual that psychoanalysis has been quite wedded to, and that most of the spin-off traditions of psychoanalytic therapy are very wedded to. And it gets to be understandable that Freud's dirty secret that he believed in telepathy, it gets to be understandable in a wholly different way. And Freud's belief in telepathy was, I think, an extraordinary example of his commitment politically to building a movement at the expense of intellectual integrity. Because it's what, 1927, I think, he writes to Ernst Jones, and Ernst Jones is admonishing him that he should not talk too much about telepathy, because it'll sully the image of the movement. And Freud writes back, and this is a paraphrase, but it's quite close. Freud writes back to Jones something like, "Believe me, my interest in telepathy is an entirely personal affair and has nothing to do with psychoanalysis." And you read those lines and you think, how the heck could that possibly be? You know, you're saying that you more or less believe in telepathy, but it can't have anything to do with a praxis in which two people are in a room. One of them is talking, the other is listening, and there is a huge bubble of energetic interconnectedness between the two of them and somatic connectedness between the two of them, even though they never physically touch.
Just one more follow-up.
Please.
It sounds like you're shifting toward a postulating the notion of a cosmopsychism where everything's interconnected, and which makes a great deal of sense when you are trying to look at how does our mind, our psyche, our embodiment participate of something that's supposed to be universal in our positing of the material world. So if we use words like vitalism or animism, which I would think at least would correspond to some degree to your notion of psychic energy, here's my sticking point. Maybe you've got the solution. What is I don't like this word mechanism because it means it's often a reductive, just a clunky word, but process system is what I prefer to call it. But what is the agency or the agentic function to the psychic energy that's disruptive? So for instance, where does it come from is my question. That's been something I've been tormented about for a while.
But that goes to two things, doesn't it? Where does it come from? Clearly, that's rather like, in fact, it's absolutely parallel with Freud's rather, in a way, Freud raised exactly that question in 1915 when he introduces the distinction between actual repression, eigentliche Verdrängung, and primary, Urverdrängung, this idea of an originative or original repression, which is basically a theory of how the quote-unquote mind breaks from the quote-unquote body and is very ungainly and prematurely formulated in a way. In a way, that's the same question. Clearly, one answer to one could say that there is a cosmos of interconnected psychic energy, which we all participate in. And then there is something else, which is the rather distinctive operation. Let's call it an operation rather than a mechanism, though really we're fudging words a bit. When something gets repressed, and for me, this is very much to do with how we encounter the incest taboo and how the incest taboo shapes us and makes us in a way that no one wants to talk about. And it's so interesting how that we could have a whole debate on interesting ideas that get quickly clouded over, shrouded over, run away from, retreated away from in psychoanalysis. Sexuality is notable. Sexuality sort of disappeared from mid-20th century psychoanalysis, and then is sort of getting resuscitated at the end of the 20th century. The notion of the unconscious as repressed disappears, and Freud is culpable of this because he muddles the word unconscious quite frequently, and it becomes just whatever is descriptively unconscious. I'm off track, but the interesting thing is there is obviously psychic energy that is there's not obvious, but it clearly is in Freud. There is psychic energy that is the result of the deformation of a representation. Now, this makes huge sense if you think of the importance of the incest taboo. And when we talk about it like this, people sort of tend to say, yeah, that does make sense. You think of the fact that you begin life in a fantastic sensual arena, an incredible sensual arena. And at some point you hit the fact that the people who are most sensually connected to you are most forbidden. That's incredible. It shapes. This is my paper on Oedipality in 2019 IJP, International Journal. That is surely what Oedipality is really about. And it does mean that some of our psychic energy, particularly the psychic energy that is stored in some sense in our sensual embodiment, that we carry with us every day and in every way, that some of this psychic energy locked within us is actually the result of the deformation of representations, things that have become unthinkable. So there's in a way, when you ask, well, what's the origin of psychic energy, you get two sorts of answers, which actually run in parallel to Freud's attempt to formulate two different notions of repression.
Thanks so much.
Roderick, you could jump it in. You're muted.
Okay, thank you very much for this really fascinating talk. Actually, I suppose I wanted just to ask a little bit further about psychic energy and two things about it really. How it sort of relates in the model that you're presenting to the to mind and body. John mentioned the sort of dual aspect monist sort of idea, which is sort of argues that it comes from a sort of Spinozist thinking, where you've got these sort of two aspects of an underlying substance, if you like. Is that the sort of model that you're talking about, or are you talking about a kind of third thing that is in some way is ontologically on a par, on the same sort of level, if you like, as mind and body, but of a different character, and in some ways rather between rather than under mind and body. So that's sort of one part of my question. You know, how I'm still trying to grasp how what you're saying relates to a dual aspect monist position, for example. And the second aspect of it is when you talk about the disruption. What is that disruption that psychic energy causes? Is it just a sort of a random disruption in so far as you've sort of discerned in what you've presented from Freud, or is it in some sense a purposeful disruption? In the sense, is there a point behind it? And if there is a point behind it, what is that point? Sorry, those sort of two questions, but I'm sure you'll find a way of weaving an answer together.
I'm not so sure, but I appreciate how sanguine you are that I will find a way of weaving them together. Look, Ethics, Spinoza's book Ethics is very difficult to read, but you get dual aspect monism. You get that there are physical expressions, and there are non-physical expressions, and there are expressions of a single thing, which he calls substance. Why that doesn't exactly fit psychoanalysis is you're getting, and I think I touched on this, but maybe I was not clear enough. You're getting a sort of a notion that psychic energy pervades the physical realm and pervades the mental realm, but it's not congruent with either. And that is a difference with Spinoza. Spinoza is very clear that there could be other attributes, which is actually fascinating. And Deleuze picks that up quite consistently. And this is also talked about a lot in Elizabeth Gross's book, which I think which never really mentions Freud anywhere, but should be sort of mandatory reading for all of us. The point being that Spinoza allows that there could be other attributes, which is fascinating. There could be other attributes other than the physical and the mental, but what in a way Freud seems to intimate, at least you could take him as intimating this, is that what this means is that the physical expression and the mental expression of substance does not have to be as causally congruent as Spinoza seems to assume in a sort of metaphysical assumptions, because there is a disruptiveness to psychic energy. And Freud is very clear. Well, it's very clear at one point. He says, look, psychic energy comes between the two. It's a mediating concept, a mediating notion. He says that one point. At another point, he says it's a frontier notion on the border between the mind and the body. Now, I don't really know what that means. I just find it very interesting as pointing to something, which is why I use this rather ugly notion of a trifold or a tripartite ontology. It's as if it's not the same thing as the mind, it's not the same thing as the body, yet it's in and it's within both of them. It's rather like the idea that I pushed a lot in my 1994 book, Psychoanalysis and the Postmodern Impulse, the idea that there's a force that is within, that is in but not of these realms. And that sort of non-identicality seems to me essential to the heart of understanding psychoanalysis. Non-identicality is key, I think, to understanding the significance, the essence of psychoanalytic discovery. And then you said you had a second point. Can you say it again?
The second point was about disruption and what, is the disruption random or in some sense purposeful? And if purposeful,
yeah, I got very preoccupied with that idea early on, because there's a sense, I mean, if you follow this idea that I was talking about in response to Dr. Mills, that representations get deformed, and they get deformed into energetic traces that are within our embodiment.
Mhm.
And they persist. You know, Freud says the unconscious never goes away. And they insist in the sense that they attempt to get back into representational form. Now, if they insist and, so to speak, attempt to get back into representational form, there's a certain sense in which they have a meaning, or they push for a certain sort of meaningfulness, not the sort of meaningfulness that you can represent reflectively. And so in a certain sense, and I'm very intrigued, I have been intrigued for decades with Freud's relationship to Franz Brentano, and what exactly does he do when he and Husserl sit side by side, not actually side by side, but close to side by side, listening to Brentano's lecture. What exactly is this idea of purposiveness, which is what you mentioned? And you can't get away from the fact that the traces within the body don't lose a certain sort of meaningfulness. And that, I think, is fascinating. And that is very much what many of the leading trends in body psychotherapy are teaching us, that you release certain things from the body and they have a certain sort of relevance to trauma, which is probably an overused notion nowadays, but useful one nonetheless. So yes, there have to be that there are different modes of meaningfulness.
Mhm.
The meaningfulness of that we know from logical analytic philosophy is not the meaningfulness of the energetic body.
No. Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I find it fascinating. The question, I think, is how does it affect our conduct of everyday life ethically, and in terms of any sort of mission that one has as a healer. And I saw from the chat line that someone keeps asking that, but I think that's
that would probably be me.
Yes.
Asking about that.
way too big.
Excuse me.
What was your thought?
Well, I think it really latches on to your what you just said about body meaningfulness, that this third mode of psychic energy, even though it's clear to me that you're trying to describe or give some sort of phenomenological description of being human, I'm still wondering where this fits into psychoanalytic work or any therapeutic endeavor. And I think that now when you mentioned a meaningfulness, which is, I don't know if only imprinted bodily, but also can be expressed bodily and can influence a whole mode of being. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that sort of meaningfulness, and how would you look at it from the perspective of healing?
Yeah, and you also have another 3 weeks for us to keep talking together. I think we have to bring together much more as healers. We have to bring, I think, first of all, the part of the critical thrust of this is that we have to get away from thinking of psychotherapy as you come in, you observe and listen to the patient. I know I'm giving a very unsophisticated picture of it or caricature of it. And in some sense, it's all about interpretations and understandings. In that sense, I feel very aligned with Bruce Fink, a Lacanian, although I'm very critical of Lacan. But in some sense, we've got to somehow get away from the idea that therapy is an epistemological venture, or that psychoanalysis was primarily an epistemological venture. So then, and I'm getting around to something of a half-assed answer to some of the things you very adeptly raised, Jen. I think we have to get around to thinking it as a radical act of listening, but listening that requires unsettling presuppositions. Psychoanalysis is a sort of deconstructive venture. This is very difficult to use words which have gained such a connotative drag that one hardly dares use them anymore. But there is something about radical listening. And there's something about radical listening, a sort of radical listening to what is otherwise than otherness. If you know Levinas, there are things otherwise than otherness which have to be listened to. I think I have a 2017 paper in the International Journal, which I think was called Listening to the Otherwise. It was called something like that, which I try to make this point. Listening to something that is otherwise than that which can be formulated. Now, to take that to your admirably practical question, which was sort of, well, what does this mean for healing? My perception is that our training as psychoanalytic psychotherapists actually makes us vulnerable to the popular criticism that we're far too cerebral. It's far too much about dialogue. It's far too much about an exchange of ideas. It's far too much about generating understandings and interpretations. It's far too much about something called insight, which we're never quite sure what it is, but we talk about it a lot as being valuable. And I think in this also, I mean, it's fascinating to me sociologically that there's a whole world of body psychotherapy out there that is practically almost completely disconnected from the psychoanalytic tradition. And yet I think the practice of listening to the body is of vital importance. Now, how does one listen to the body? And how does one listen to the body when it speaks a different language, for want of a better way of thinking about it? What I mean, my life is I see 10 patients a day, and all of them 4 days a week. So I'm a very privileged psychoanalyst. I have a completely full practice of 4 days a week, patients lying on the couch. Most of them are trainees in psychoanalysis. And one of the things that has evolved in my personal practice since my training in Michigan is we end up, I say we, the patient and I, end up listening to bodies a lot. And how does one listen to bodies, and how does one attend to a body in a receptive way such that one can listen to it rather than think about it? You know, the patient whose leg twitches at particular moments as he lies on the couch, how instead of thinking about it, like, what does my leg mean? How do you allow the leg to speak to you? Now, I'm sure at this point that quite a number of you think I'm talking gibberish, but there is a certain way of listening to the body that allows the body to speak. I have a paper in the, I have a 2016 paper on listening to the body in psychoanalytic practice. And my thinking about it has actually gone quite a long way since then. I was trained in a number of varieties of body psychotherapy. Now, body psychotherapists very often to get the body to release certain things that it has neurotically or characterologically held, they have certain sorts of modes of intervention. There's a lot to be said for and against some of those practices. I'm making such whopping generalizations, I'm embarrassing myself. But there's some way in which we have to bring that together with the richness of our psychoanalytic notions of practice. There, I've successfully sidestepped your question completely.
No, you haven't, not
No.
even a bit. I want to thank you very much. And it's very interesting because I was listening to you through a very Lacanian prism from the beginning, and through my head was running exactly the differences between signifier and letter, between an interpretation that is what you would say cerebral, or one that is a transgression or a blunder. The difference between language and the lang. I was struck by how it somehow converges. Even though I understand you're very critical about Lacanian thought, but this trying to conceptualize this thing, exactly this thing that cannot be conceptualized, really for me sort of converged with Lacanian thought and gave it different words. And I think for me, whenever I try to think about it, it always boils down to something very individual and the way you do it. And I think that's why I asked you, because I was wondering how you would express it, formulate it. So thank you.
No, I would love to talk to you more about this, because I think it's vitally important for the future of our field, whatever our field is. I'm never quite sure what our field is, because as I said at the beginning, psychoanalysis has become such a sort of pluralistic mess that one doesn't quite know what the field is of psychoanalysis. But I think I think there are commonalities and divergences here. And I have been since 1984 quite severely critical of Lacan in different sorts of ways. But one of the things, just to end on a very practical note, one of the things that my training in India has helped me with is I introduced breathing quite a lot into psychoanalytic practice. I don't think Lacanians would do that, at least not the ones that I know. The Lacanians I know and that I ambivalently love, I don't think they think about the body in that way. But there's something about breathing and noticing the breath while being on the couch in psychoanalysis and free associating that I think is extremely rich in terms, or I know it to be extremely rich in terms of how one opens oneself to a different sort of being becoming than can be captured in reflective thought.
Dr. Barratt, we need to stop now. Thank you for such a rich experience, so many great ideas and personal experiences you have. There is that song, that says, let me hear your body talk. I don't know if you know that. Thank you.
I was under the impression that song was about something rather different from a healing practice.
Well,
but maybe not.
Who knows what's healing? Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for coming. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.